is the webinar on the benefits of becoming both 245D and VRS/SSB service providers. My name is Eric Pedersen with Star Services. Here's a quick agenda for the day. First, we're going to be going over an overview of E1MN, which some of you are familiar with, but you'll get a quick overview of that. We'll also go over the Engage, Plan, Find, Keep framework. We'll have an overview of the VRS SSB program. Talk a little bit about the importance of becoming a duly enrolled provider with both 245D and VRS SSB. And then we'll have two breakout sections, which is really the heart of today's presentation, to have two breakout sessions, one for providers who are new to 245D services, and we'll have an explanation of the enrollment process in that. And then also another one for people who are new to the VRS SSB services, and we'll have an explanation of that contracting process and how to work through that. Real quick here, we'll go through our presenters for the day. And so if you could all introduce yourself in order of the slide here.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining. My name is Amanda Jensen Stahl, and I'm the Manager of Interagency Partnerships and Business Engagement at DEED, Vocational Rehabilitation Services, or VRS.
Hi, I'm Angie Hart with Star Services. I am Vice President there and oversee a lot of our 245D consulting and training services.
Hello, my name is Ann Paulson. I'm a program specialist with the Community Partnerships Unit with DEED, Vocational Rehabilitation Services.
And I'm Eric Pedersen from Star Services.
I'm Jennifer Bielke, Program Administrator with State Services for the Blind. I am a vendor liaison.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Mers. I'm our Employment Coordinator with the Disability Services Division at DHS. Thanks for joining today.
And I'm Sarah Sundin, also a Rehab Program Specialist with DEED Vocational Services. Welcome.
And I'll note too that we do have captioning services, which if you need the captioning services in the chat, the link to that captioning service. And we do have sign language interpreters today provided by the American Sign Language Interpreting Services. Next, we will talk a little bit about what's upcoming today. We're not going to cover every detail related to this change today. There are going to be some more webinars coming up in the near future to talk a little bit more in depth in this rollout of this change. There's the E1MN core trainings on the 27th and 29th, and again on May 4th. So those are 2-hour sessions to learn more about E1MN. There's also the coffee chats, which are more of an informal 60-minute webinar. It gives you more of a chance to ask questions directly and get them answered in those coffee chats. You can find all of those on the E1MN Trainings and Events website. There's also a section there where you can ask a question for those coffee chats or submit a question ahead of time. And we'll have the slides from today available there as well. If you've been in a 200+ person webinar in the past, you know that it's not the ideal format for a Q&A. So we're not going to do that today. If there are questions, you can certainly post them in the chat or go to that the E1MN Trainings and Events site and post them to the coffee chats would be a better way. If there are ways we can answer those questions in the context of today's webinar, we'll do so. And in the breakout sessions, there may be more ability to answer any specific questions. So next, I want to just give a real high-level view of acronyms here, recognizing that not everyone here is familiar with both DHS and DEED. So this is as basic as it comes, but really the two departments we're referencing today are two separate agencies at the state. One, DHS, which covers home and community-based services, under which we have 245D licensed services, under which we have employment services along with a number of other services. And then we have the Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED. And under that department, we have VRS, or Vocational Rehabilitation Services, and State Services for the Blind, or SSB. So just to throw out all the acronyms in the beginning that that you've probably all heard, but we'll use them today. That's how these two services relate to, these two departments relate to each other. Our goal for today really is to explain the changes that are coming up to employment supports, number one. Two is help you understand how being duly enrolled with both 245D and VRS SSB is going to help ensure the continuity of services in the future for you as a provider and for the individuals we support. And third is give you a better understanding of that enrollment process. So if you're not currently enrolled with 245D services, to give you a good understanding of the process there, and similarly for the VRS SSB program, so you can go and take action. And that'll be in the breakout sections at the end. Today's presentation will have the first part here. We'll be talking to everybody. We're going to go into breakout rooms at the end, so you can choose your breakout room. After that point, the presentation will be over. So we won't be coming back as a group to the main presentation. So really it's choosing which path that you'd want to look into, whether it's the 245D or the VRS SSB at the end. And if you're interested in both, you can, this will be posted again on that E1MN trainings and events page. So if you missed one of the presentations, you could go watch it at that site. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ryan Mers from DHS and talk a little bit more about the E1MN overview. Ryan?
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. You can advance to the next slide here. In this first section, I'm going to give an overview of E1MN, which is our state agency partnership advancing employment first. So this partnership is led by the 3 state agencies listed on the slide: the Department of Human Services, our Disability Services Division, the Minnesota Department of Education, the Career and Technical Education, as well as Special Education areas, as well as the Department of Employment and Economic Development, Vocational Rehabilitation Services, and State Services for the Blind. So the reason we've got our 3 agencies all together in this partnership is because we each play such a critical role in advancing employment first and creating those employment opportunities and supports for people with disabilities in Minnesota. So we each have kind of a key piece or programs in solving that puzzle. You know, another important aspect of our E1MN partnership, or this collaboration we have around employment first, is we really have 2 components to it. One, which is E1 Youth, and that's really our supports and our efforts related to students or transition age youth, and how we're working to support employment for those young adults. And that's especially where the Department of Education is an important partner. And then also E1 Adult, which is where Waiver, or that DHS Disability Services Division, and VRS and SSB have that strong partnership. And for people receiving waiver services outside of school, how do we collaborate and work together across our programs for those employment first outcomes? So a lot of today is motivated around that E1 Adult effort, and looking at how do we sequence and sequence our services and collaborate across our programs in achieving those ends, and making sure that we deliver a more seamless and timely employment support system. Next slide here. All right. So I'm going to go in a little bit. I'm going to go into some of the details about E1MN and kind of our shared values and visions and what we're trying to do. But I also want to, before going into that, I want to set the stage a little bit with backgrounds about why this is such an important effort, or how E1MN came to be. And I think it really starts looking all the way back to some of the changes in federal policy and guidance around 2014. I know on the VR end and SSB, looking at the Workforce Innovations and Opportunities Act, and on the waiver end, that 245D end, the CMS final rule. And those changes, those policies really shifted the way that our programs work together, kind of charged us in no longer thinking about, especially for people with significant disabilities or who may be accessing waiver services, that people had too many barriers to employment or couldn't benefit from services. So those policies shifted the way that our programs work together a little bit, and really raised the question of, all right, if we're both providing supports and both have employment supports for people with disabilities or people receiving waiver services in Minnesota. How do we work together to do that? So we had that federal policy backdrop in 2014. And additionally, in 2018, on the DHS, our HCBS waiver services, we introduced 3 new employment services: employment exploration, development, and support. And those services they really specified our employment supports and created some new supports related to that. But again, also raised that question of how does all this work with vocational rehabilitation services and state services for the blind? At that time, we released interim guidance to talk about how, for case managers and looking at how do you work across programs and authorized services, knowing that we needed to really dig into this and figure out a more seamless and holistic approach to employment supports in Minnesota. So with that sort of charge, in 2019, DEED and DHS, with both of those backdrops, signed a memorandum of understanding, kind of laying out, hey, here's how our programs work together, creating a shared understanding of that federal guidance, and really kind of leaning into it, creating agreements about, hey, how are we going to make this work? And during that MOU process, and even beyond that MOU process, moving in today, really doing a lot of stakeholder engagement and kind of both, at the national level, working with technical assistance organizations to see how are other states doing this, getting really clear on that federal policy. And then at sort of the local level, as well as the state level in Minnesota, going to different parts of the states and meeting with teams of vocational rehabilitation services, state services for the blind counselors, waiver case managers, employment service providers, and hearing, what works, what doesn't work. And a lot of that stakeholder engagement, some of the learnings that we had is there's a lack of clarity in how our programs work together, and confusion and different ways of doing things across the state. And this can mean a bumpy process for people. It can mean it's not always clear how to work across programs or who should be doing what. And that adds a lot of motivation to our work under that MOU and then under E1MN. So we heard this feedback, kind of built some clarity in this area, and then and we created these interagency agreements, and then now we're implementing those agreements, and we're living into that MOU. As we move forward into implementation, we really didn't want to base our efforts in sort of a legalese document or going back to a memorandum of understanding, but we wanted to root that collaboration in our shared values and our shared vision and employment first and what we want for the state. And that's where E1MN came about. E1MN was a way to communicate our shared commitment and our partnership to employment and kind of bring some energy across our agencies in supporting that. So that's some of the background for how we got to E1MN. Next slide. So in setting that shared vision, we will be working together to align our systems so that our common customers or people receiving home and community-based services or HCBS disability waivers and vocational rehabilitation services or state services for the blind get seamless and timely support to make informed choices and meet their competitive integrated employment goals. So that's the guiding vision for our work as we move forward in E1MN. Next slide, Eric. Under this effort and to fulfill that vision, we have a lot of different areas of work going on. We're working on our referral processes. We're working in collaboration with stakeholders. But a couple of highlights of this partnership is, one, we're planning and improving our coordinated services and our employment first approaches. So how are we approaching employment and sequencing our services? Secondly, we're identifying barriers and confusion and then removing those barriers and confusion to make it easier for people to navigate employment services in Minnesota. And then three, keeping an equity lens as a critical piece of our work. And so working with local and culturally specific partners to improve access and equity to supports and employment outcomes. And then finally, just supporting each other to bring out the best each of our agencies have to offer. So really trying to bring for Minnesotans kind of the best we have to bear across our programs and our agencies. Next slide. On that E1MN website that Eric mentioned earlier at the beginning, we have our shared values and principles posted, and those are important components of our work for today's webinar. There's 4 here that I especially wanted to highlight, kind of the guide looking at, as we encourage dual enrollment or employment service providers to work across our systems, some of the values and principles that really underlie that and why that's so important. And first is, obviously employment first. So, fulfilling Minnesota's employment first policy and creating that expectation that that people will be successful in competitive integrated employment with the right supports and really living in to make that a reality for the people we serve. Secondly is person-centeredness. We'll embed person-centered principles and work in our work to help people move towards meaningful employment that builds on their unique interests, strengths, and talents. So helping people get, the right job or the job for them, not just a job. And then third is collaboration. We want to build coordinated and consistent communication, training, and support. Hopefully today is evidence of that, of us living into that principle or value, but really we're trying to speak with more of a unified voice and really get information out across to all of our partners. And then finally, simplicity. We want to develop a system that is easier to understand, implement, and navigate for people. So as we start talking about all these different programs and these changes in federal guidance and different services, it can feel really confusing and it can be hard to navigate. And we're really keeping that simplicity as a front focus for us and trying to make this as clear as possible and as easy to navigate for people. Next slide. All right. So that's a broad overview of E1MN and our overarching partnership that crosses a lot of different areas, and we have a lot of different work going on related to it. One important piece of that work is really clarifying how our services sequence or work together. Sort of where do you go for what service when? And to help communicate that sequencing or live into that simplicity, to try to make that understandable for people, we developed an engage, plan, find, keep framework for employment supports. So I'm going to go over that framework right now. Next slide, Eric. So what it is, it's a high-level framework for how people receiving waiver services access employment supports across school, VRS SSB, and waiver programs. In kind of a curt sense or a quick sense is it's broadly who pays for what when. So what programs providing what supports at what time. And we'll be using this framework as a training resource and a method to introduce how our programs work together to stakeholders. So especially for support professionals, figuring out how we structure their supports. Hopefully this framework helps build some understanding there. And then what's next with this framework is that we'll be using it in trainings and then also releasing guidance over the summer that will equip support professionals to more deeply understand and work within this framework. So I'll get into that kind of timeline stuff right at the end here. And just a quick check on terms. I'm saying support professionals really is a way to talk about, BR counselors, state services for the blind counselors, employment service providers, waiver case managers, all of us that are kind of working in this realm. Next slide. All right. In line with our E1MN structure, we've broken this framework into 2 sections, one for adults and one for students. And the reason why we have those 2 different slides to it is just because of those school services through the Department of Education and considering when those supports come into bear, as well as the pre-employment transition services through VRS. So this first slide is focusing on adults, and that means we're looking at the primary funding sources for people who are receiving waiver services, but who are not enrolled in high school or age 18 to 21 transition programming. It's a lot to say, but basically people receiving waiver services who aren't in school or a transition program. And you'll see on this slide, there's 4 boxes: engage, plan, find, keep. And those are phases or ways to think about a person's stage in their employment path. Are they engaging in conversations about employment? making informed choices about pursuing competitive integrated employment. Are they planning? Are they career planning or thinking about what they want to do and what their strengths are? For find, are they conducting a job search or actually going out and getting that competitive employment? And then keep is, is someone in a job and needs some support to successfully maintain that employment. So they need to continue to be successful in their job. So engage, plan, find, keep is those 4 boxes. You'll see right below each of those large font words is a specific service that supports someone at that stage. And then the results of that service. And then at the bottom is a colored box under there denoting that primary funding source. So for engage and plan, it's waiver services. For find, it's vocational rehabilitation services or state services for the blind. And for keep, it's back to those waiver supports through DHS. And now looking at each of these phases in engage, plan, find, keep specifically. For engage, an important employment service in this area is waiver employment exploration services. So when someone needs help making those informed choices about employment, exploration is a great tool that we can use to support them. And so the goal of exploration services, or what it results in, is an informed choice about competitive integrated employment. And that means that we're working with someone to address their barriers and concerns related to employment. We're providing opportunities so that they have experiences in community employment, and that they're really understanding the risks and benefits of different choices related to getting a job. Second, for planning, this is, for those of you that are familiar with waiver services, this is where our waiver employment development service comes into play. And specifically, we're specifying a part of that service as a planning phase of waiver employment development services. It's kind of a front part of that service, and it results in preliminary employment goals and a portfolio to springboard a job search. But really, that career planning part of development is all about helping someone understand, hey, what are areas that I would want to, what are jobs or industries that I'm interested in? What are my strengths? What do I bring to bear in the employment realm? What are places I'm potentially interested in working in? And, figuring out things like transportation or identifying conditions for employment. For that find phase, when someone's, conducting a job search and looking for that good fit, that's where vocational rehabilitation services and state services for the blind, their job search and stability services, really come into bear. And that results in competitive integrated employment. So those are supports to help someone get that job in the community. And then finally, when someone has a job and they need ongoing supports to maintain employment, our waiver employment support services can be a great resource to give that ongoing support, like job coaching, to maintain that employment. So that's the engage, plan, find, keep framework for adults. I know it's a lot to take in, but high level idea of how we're describing our different services. If you go to the next slide, Eric. These next 2 slides just kind of get into a little bit more detail on each of those phases, and really talk about what audiences, or as you're trying to think of, what would make sense when, what's the audience of this, people who could potentially benefit from this service. So for engage, again, that exploration service for people who are unsure about working in competitive integrated employment. Maybe they haven't done it before, maybe they've got some concerns. Exploration can help them explore all of that and make that decision. Second, for people who have said yes to a conversation about employment options during a WIOA 511 conversation. So as part of the conditions on paying sub-minimum wages in Minnesota, people participate in annual conversations about pursuing competitive employment. And they'll, say, yes, I'm interested in more conversations about employment, or no, I'm not right now. So when you have someone that's saying yes, exploration can be a way to build on that conversation and keep exploring the options there. And then thirdly, for people that have been working in non-competitive employment, so maybe they're participating in pre-vocational services to develop some of those foundational work skills, or participating in community-based mobile work crews. Exploration can be a tool to help them look at competitive integrated employment. For the planning service, or for waiver employment development services, that planning phase, this can help people discover their interests and their strengths and prepare for a job search. So this would be great for people who are interested in employment, like, yeah, I want a job, but maybe not quite sure what that looks like or what they want to do. Maybe they have a lot of barriers that they need to address or conditions for employment, or maybe they have little experience in competitive employment. That planning service can help people develop that plan and kind of discover their personal strengths and interests. Next slide. For Find, again, these are VRS SSB job search and stability services, and they help people obtain competitive integrated employment. So if you've got someone, you know, again, we're talking people receiving waiver services here who has a disability, is interested in competitive employment, VRS SSB have great supports to find that job in the community, to find that competitive employment. And then over to Keep, our waiver employment support services for someone that has a job and needs ongoing support. So not time limited, but ongoing supports to maintain that employment. Our waiver employment support services can provide those supports to keep and succeed in community employment. And one final note here, although we've laid this out as kind of a sequential format, or a kind of engage, plan, find, keep, it's really important to note that we're just describing the phases of where someone might be in their employment journey, but people are going to jump in at different parts. So you might have someone who starts at engage, you might have someone who's coming and already has a job, or who wants to immediately start a job search. There's no need to, people don't have to go through each of these. It's really depending where they're at. There's just supports available for them. Next slide, Eric. In this last slide, I really want to touch on it, at least briefly, because it's so important to look at students, and I always think transition age youth, because it's just such a critical point to be engaging people and setting those students on a positive trajectory and helping them fulfill their dreams as they look into adulthood, or as they look at exiting the school system. So this slide, mirrors that first slide, but looks at students. So students who are enrolled in high school or age 18 to 21 transition programming. And I think one of the big takeaways here on this slide is really just looking at all that front end, engage, plan, find, is really the vocational rehabilitation services, state services for the blind, and school districts. So for engage and plan, it's school and VR transition and pre-employment transition services. They help students graduate with a person-centered plan for post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. So those services are just so critical at that front age, or at that front end. For Find, there's school work-based learning programs, in VRS SSB work-based learning, and job search and stability services to help students get competitive integrated employment. On the Keep side is where waiver services come back into play a little bit here, where if a student has a job and it's during school hours, then school transition services provide those supports if it's part of that school day. But if it's outside of that school day, like a summer job or any employment outside of school, waiver employment support services is there to provide those ongoing supports for students to maintain that employment. So this is engage, plan, find, keep from a student lens. Thank you. All right, and so this is my last slide for this section. And what I want to do is leave you all with a timeline for how we want to implement this framework. And it starts in this coming July. So that interim guidance that I mentioned earlier, we published when we rolled out those 3 new waiver employment services. DHS will be replacing that interim guidance with just guidance on how to work across programs. And that guidance will live into that engage, plan, find, keep framework. Additionally, with that, we'll be releasing new HCPC codes, which is basically we'll be specifying a plan and a find phase for employment development services, and giving case managers the ability to separately authorize and track those two phases of employment development services. So we'll have that new ability to specify the phase of employment development service, as well as new guidance for case managers to begin support planning under. Then in September 2021 is when any new authorization of employment development services or change in authorization will have to use those new codes to align to engage, plan, find, keep, and specify the phase of the service. So again, we published that guidance in July, and then in September, from our systems perspective, is when we kind of require it to start being implemented, to give case managers and everyone some time to start support planning and aligning to that guidance direction. Throughout this process, we'll be providing technical assistance, trainings, and tools and resources to support the implementation of our agreements and to live into this framework. And then a final note here is this will be what maybe, if it makes sense for people, a rolling implementation or something that occurs at annual renewal. So for people who are currently receiving employment development services, so maybe they're doing a job search using waiver services right now, they can continue to receive those services or participate in that development services, until there's the end of that service span or change in authorization. So to try to say that a little bit more simply, people currently receiving development services can keep doing it, but it's really at those new authorizations after September that we start transitioning into that new framework. So I believe that is it for my section here. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda for an overview of VRS and SSB.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So again, this is Amanda Jensen-Stahl with DEED VRS. I'm going to start off here and give just a high-level overview of who we are, and then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Jennifer Bialke to talk specifically about SSB. Next slide, please, Eric. So some of you may be very familiar with who we are, but some of you may not, and hopefully you will join us in the breakout room. But we wanted to just give really a high-level overview of who we are, particularly for those of you who are considering perhaps working with us. So some of you, this might be very familiar, so hang in there. This is just a brief overview. So Vocational Rehabilitation Services, VRS, we are part of the Department of Employment and Economic Development, DEED, and we are all about empowering people with disabilities to achieve their goals for competitive integrated employment and career development. And so earlier, as Ryan was outlining this work together, it's really, we're all about competitive integrated employment. And we provide individualized, person-centered counseling, training, job skills, and job placement services. Next slide, please. And how we do that is a little different than the 245D waiver licensing. So we have what's called a professional and technical contract. You'll hear us refer to it as a PT contract. And that is how we purchase services from providers. They develop a PT contract, and then that's how we are able to contract with them. Many of the providers that work with VRS are CARF accredited, and per state rule, those service providers that are CARF accredited have no maximum budget cap. We also have a category called limited use vendor. We like to call them LUVs because we like our acronyms. They are service providers who are not CARF accredited. So part of our state rule, we have to limit the amount of business we do with LUVs. What is really exciting is that in 2020, we raised our limit for the amount that we're able to contract with LUVs to $100,000 per year, which is significant because it used to only be $20,000. And that has been part of our effort in working with DHS because we knew that we wanted to have more dual providers, and frankly, 20,000 wasn't a lot. And we knew that we had smaller providers or providers who wanted to dip their toe in the water and maybe think about, okay, what might it look like to work with us, and maybe not go for that CARF accreditation. And so we're really excited to be able to announce that LUVs can do up to $100,000 per year. Next slide, please, Eric. So a little bit, just again, very high level. If you have questions, in our breakout session, we can really get into the details of this, but wanted to just highlight how our contracts work. So as a provider, you develop an individualized contract that includes the services that you provide. We know that providers are different across the state, and you have different expertise and different specialties. And so if you look at contracts of our providers, sometimes they look very different. And then the rates, they are negotiated for what they charge for each service. One big question that we get asked a lot is, how do we pay for job search services? And it's called a performance-based agreement. Again, we like our acronyms, and you'll hear it referred to as a PBA. So we have 2 PBAs. We're very excited about this. So a lot of you, particularly if you are a contractor with VRS, are very familiar with what we're going to call the general PBA, and it's $3,800. We are now going to be introducing a new PBA. It's called the E1 PBA, and that will be at a rate of $5,000. What I want to highlight is that PBA is only going to be for people on waivers. So it's part of this work with DHS and part of this E1MN work. This is brand new. So whether you're an existing provider, just know that more information, training, and guidance will be coming out on this. And for new providers or potential providers, we wanted to be able to give you that idea so that you are able to take that into consideration as you're thinking about becoming a provider with VRS or SSB. So in summary, some of the rates that we have are negotiated with the provider. Some of our rates are standard, like a PBA. So a PBA is a milestone outcome-based payment. So we don't bill hourly, or we don't bill by 15-minute increments by the waiver, and that is standard across the board. So no matter what provider, where you are at in the state, it's the same milestone outcome rate, and that will still be the same for E1 PBA as well as general PBA. Next slide, please. This gives just a high-level overview of what you would need to do to develop a contract with VRS. Sarah, Ann, and Jennifer in the breakout session will be going into a little bit more detail, but wanted to highlight our website is a great resource for you to go. This information actually comes directly from the website. And really the first step is to review and complete an application to become a provider. We then take that, review it, and then work directly with providers to make sure that they have everything that's necessary and really guide you through the process of creating a PT contract, especially that first time around. You might have questions, it's going to be new. And so we have staff who really guide you through that process. Next slide, please. And then finally, as I mentioned, we have awesome staff. They are available to answer questions. And so if you have questions, here's the contact information for Ann and Sarah at VRS, and then for Jennifer Bialke. And in the breakout session, they'll have their information again, and then we'll make sure that when the slides are posted on the website, you'll be able to go here and easily get their email as well as their phone number. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to highlight state services for the blind.
Thank you. This is Jennifer Bialke with State Services for the Blind. I'd like to give an overview. There are many ways that we are very similar to vocational rehabilitation services. I'm going to abbreviate that VRS. As Amanda said, we do like our acronyms. So I will also abbreviate to SSB for State Services for the Blind. As I was saying, there's many ways that we are very similar to VRS, but there are a few key ways that we are different. So we are also a division of DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development. We're basically sister agencies. And our mission is to facilitate the achievement of vocational and personal independence by Minnesotans who are blind, visually impaired, or deafblind. And like VRS, SSB provides individualized, personalized, person-centered counseling, training, job skills, and job placement services. But we also provide adjustment to blindness training that often goes along with blindness, low vision, and deaf blindness. Those skills that are required by blind individuals that would often include Braille training, orientation and mobility training, technology training, those and other blindness skills training. And in addition to vocational rehabilitation services, we do have a senior services unit, which helps to help seniors maintain their independence in their homes. We have a business enterprises program, which is also known as the federal blind vending program. We have a communication center that provides Braille and digital audio books for K through 12 and post-secondary education and the community. We also have the radio talking book that's accessed through the internet, apps, and Alexa. And SSB services are available statewide. Next slide, please. So like VRS, SSB also purchases services from providers who have a professional and technical contract. But the main difference is that SSB does not require CARF, does not have that CARF requirement. And we also do not have the rule on limited use vendors. Next slide, please. Okay, well, you can go back to the previous slide for me. Okay, so I have a little bit of information that I guess I don't have a slide for, but that's okay. So as the same as VRS, providers do need to develop an individualized contract that includes the services that they provide and the rates that they charge for each service, the same as VRS. And SSB also pays for performance-based agreements for job search, the same. SSB has one PBA. We did not develop a new PBA for the E1. We have one PBA and it has two rates. We have a rate for blind and low vision, and that's at $8,000, and it has a rate for deaf blind, and that's at $14,000. And the reason being that it is much more intense. When you are working with a deaf-blind individual, it is much more intense, more services are required, it is often takes longer, you need to work with interpreters, and so there is a differential for working with deaf-blind individuals. Like VRS, some rates are negotiated with the provider and some rates are standardized nationwide, or excuse me, statewide, like for the PBA. And our application process is very similar to VRS. So, okay. And then you can, next slide. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer and Amanda and Ryan for that overview. what I'm going to talk about a little bit here is just the wrapping this up before we go into the breakout rooms and talk a little bit about why becoming duly enrolled is so important. So as you've seen, these changes that are coming up are going to make it more and more essential that providers can provide the full array of services between both funding sources to ensure continuity. And that's really what it's all about, is ensuring continuity of services for the people you support along their employment journey. With any change, of course, there's work that needs to be done, but there's also opportunities that come out of that change. I think for providers, what you'll see here is a more diversified source of funding, which over the past year, we've all seen the importance of that. So having more options for the people you support, an opportunity to expand to do new populations of people that you haven't supported in the past, and also new tools to support your employment services. Both DHS and VRS and SSB come with their own tools, and they're working really hard right now to combine some tools for the E1MN project, provide new information and resources for providers that will, I think, overall enhance a provider's ability to provide employment services. And of course, for the recipients, continuity is important, of course, but it's also will provide more choice as there are more providers in this space, and hopefully then better employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. I'm going to go through a quick scenario, and I will admit this is kind of an idealistic scenario, and very few people's journey is this clean. But just to kind of reiterate the framework that Ryan had talked about and how that will interact between waiver services and voc rehab services, let's just look at this person, John, who's starts out probably unsure or maybe unsure about working. He wants some help in addressing his concern, deciding if he wants a job. So he's in that explore phase. And in that case, what's going to happen is John's case manager would authorize employment exploration services to help him make an informed choice about his employment. Then he'd move on to, if he decides he wants to work, but he's not sure necessarily what kind of job or what he has to offer an employer, he'd move into that planning phase. And that's where he would talk about employment or questions about transportation, about how employment might affect his benefits, etc. In that case, John's case manager is authorizing employment development services under the waiver, under the plan phase. Next, after he's done that piece, and he wants to go out and find a job, he's moving into the find phase. And this is where the E1 PBA would kick in. And he would do his employment search through that process. And that would start at the job search phase through job stabilization. And when it's been determined that that job is stable, John, his boss, the team, they all verify that this is a good fit, this is working, and we have a stable position. If he needs ongoing supports, he's going to move into the keep phase and go through employment support services under the waiver. So as Ryan mentioned, people don't always follow this path exactly. Some people come in at the planning stage. Some people come in having a job and just need support in that job and keeping that. And some people will move backwards to find other services or having an additional need to plan for a job change. So any of those conditions can happen, but this is kind of how that framework lays out for folks. Okay, so next steps. If you're not already a 245D provider and you're interested in doing that, start that process. Also goes for folks who are not currently contracted with VRS SSB to start that process. The 2 breakout sessions we have will give more detail on the process itself. I'd also encourage you to visit the E1MN Trainings and Events website to register for upcoming trainings, find more information. And like Ryan had mentioned, there's a lot coming out over the summer here that you'll want to keep track of. And with that, we'll look at the breakout rooms. Again, breakout room 1 here will be for 245D services. So it's going to, Angie Hart from Star Services is going to talk about the process for obtaining a license, enrolling in HCBS as an HCBS provider. Talk about going to overview of the DCDM requirements, staff training requirements, and summary of the paperwork and meeting requirements. And in the other breakout session, VRS SSB will be presenting on an overview, completing the application, and the PT contract processing requirements. So with that, we will again do the breakout rooms here. You'll, I believe, choose your breakout room. And again, we're not coming back as a whole group. So after the breakout session is done, this presentation is done. Like I said before, if you want to see the other presentation, it will be available on the E1MN site.